Hello and welcome to another edition of Wildcard MTG. Back again with another deck tech. This time, for this deck tech, we are building a Hare Apparent deck, one of the new cards from Foundations. It's one of the new you can have any amount of X cards in your deck kind of cards, sort of like Persistent Petitioners or Dragon's Approach, cards like that. Now, I chose to build around Kwain, Itinerant Meddler, instead of what most people are going with, which seems to be either Miss Bumbleflower or some of the Selesnya rabbits from Bloomborough. I realize those are probably the way to go, and you can build stronger, more beadier and meatier, bigger bunnies that way. I opted for a less is more approach. Less colors, a little bit more of a group hug, still kind of like Miss Bumbleflower would do, but we don't really need the green. I do realize the deck could be probably way, way stronger with it because of all the buffs that certain rabbits get, but that's not how I wanted to build it. I wanted to do something a little different, but still keep it somewhat themed to bunnies and rabbits. So, yeah, we're doing Kwain. Kwain says Kwain Itinerant Meddler, 1 white, 1 blue. He's a legendary creature rabbit wizard. You can tap him. Each player may draw a card, then each player who drew a card this way gains 1 life. Pretty simple and straightforward commander. Lets everyone draw a card and gain a life if they chose. And, the best way to really utilize Kwain is on a player's end step right before your turn. So that way you get the most value and cards out of your turn. So that way you're basically drawing 2 cards at the start of your turn, even though it's on somebody's end step. You're not going to be giving other players cards, extra cards that way, because they can't play them on their turns, really. So you kind of get that. Now, let's get on to the best part of the deck. That is all the mana value and the stats and everything to really kind of learn how this deck works and how it runs and all that. So the average mana value of the deck is about 1.59, so pretty low. In fact, about 40 of our cards come from the 2-drop slot alone, and that's because of how many Hare Apparents we were running, along with all the removal and counter spells we have in the deck as well. So let's get into some of those 1-drops here. We have 1 creature, 3 instants, 1 artifact, and 1 enchantment, and we have a 97.74% chance of playing those on curve. And the big beefiness of the deck, the 2-drop slot, we're running 29 creatures, 1 sorcery, 6 instants, and 3 artifacts. We have a 90.58% chance of playing those on curve. And in our 3-drop, we are running 5 sorceries and 2 instants, and we have a 78.05% chance of playing those on curve. And for the 4-drops, we have 1 creature, 2 sorceries, 1 instant, and 3 enchantments, and we have a 62.09% chance of playing those on curve. And in the 5-drop slot, we have 1 sorcery, 2 artifacts, and 1 enchantment, and we have a 45.64% chance of playing those on curve. And in the 6-drop slot, we have 1 instant, and we have a 31.12% chance of playing that on curve. Now, if you look at the breakup of the mana symbols here, 19% of the cards in our deck have blue, but our blue mana production is 42%, so we are good. 78% of the symbols are white in the deck, but we have 97% white mana production. I'll get into that a little later. We did something a little different with the land base in this deck. It's nothing too crazy to go into, but there's a difference in how I kind of built the land base. So that's the kind of overall breakdown value of the mana symbols. So with that, let's move on to the creatures. We got a pretty slim list here. So yes, we're running 30 creatures, but we'll get to that and why there are 30 creatures and what we're running. But before that, the main creatures that we're running to help facilitate that, we have Hinterland Sanctifier, Jacked Rabbit, Regal Bunnicorn, Valley Quest Caller, Warren Warleader, And then we are running 25 copies of Hare Apparent. In fact, we could even bump that up to maybe 26, but I chose 25. That's the bulk of our deck. That's most of the creatures we were running are Hare Apparents. It's a lot of them, I know, but there's a reason for it, trust me. We're running 25 of them with a few utility rabbits like Warren Warleader and Valley Quest Caller to kind of help buff them once they've hit the battlefield. Now, if those utility rabbits stick around, it'll definitely help a lot. If not, we have ways of getting them back from the graveyard. We'll get to that later. And then also a new card from Foundations as well called Hinterland Sanctifier. That will also help us gain a lot of life from all these bunnies entering the battlefield. That'll help against aggro decks if we happen to play against them. So that's pretty much it on the creatures. Like I said, because we're running 25, we could get into what Hare Apparent does. So what does Hare Apparent do? Why are we running 25 of them? Well, it says when this creature enters, create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to the number of other creatures you control named Hare Apparent. A deck can have any number of cards named Hare Apparent. So basically, more and more bunnies, the more and more Hare Apparents you have on the battlefield. So if you have 2 out, you're getting 2 bunnies. If you have 3 out, the next time you play one, you're getting 3 more bunnies. If you have 4 out, the next time you play one, 4, 5, 6, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So let's get into the sorceries here. We have Ascend from Avernus, Cut a Deal, Flood of Recollection, Pull from the Deep, Raise the Past, Secret Rendezvous, Savine's Reclamation, Tempt with Bunnies, and Time Wipe. Now we're only running one board wipe, but the way to really play this board wipe is kind of in our advantage if we can do it this way, Magical Christmas Land. But also, just in case somebody else's board gets way out of control, it's okay to run this one. But really the way to play it is if we have Time Wipe, then either the same turn if we have the mana, or next turn we play Ascend from Avernus or Raise from the Past. So that way we can get all of our Hare Apparents back, and they're all going to trigger off each other once they hit the battlefield. So then we're going to get a bunch of 1/1s off of all of those coming back. In fact, let's look at what those 2 cards say. So Ascend from Avernus says, return all creatures and planeswalker cards with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, then exile Ascend from Avernus. So it's 3 white and X, so you only have to pump 2 mana into it. So that way you can get all your Hare Apparents back because they're only 2 mana. So 5 mana in total is not too bad on that. And again, once they all enter the battlefield, they're going to see each other, and then you'll get a bunch of 1/1s just off that alone. And Raise the Past is 2 generic, 2 white sorcery. It says return all creature cards in mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So again, that will hit the Hare Apparents. It will hit Kwain itself. It'll hit the Bunnicorn. It'll hit the Valley Quest Caller. It'll even technically hit Jack Rabbit. You just won't get the Ravenous thing off of it. But still, that's a lot of creatures to get back from the graveyard just with these 2 cards alone. And again, if there's a bunch of Hare Apparents in your graveyard, like 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll get a bunch of tokens of all those hitting the battlefield. So really cool to keep in mind. So we're running a couple other sorceries really in this deck, like Flood of Recollection and Pull from the Deep, to be able to get Raised from the Past back to our hand in order to use it again, just in case our board gets wiped or targeted removal starts happening, stuff like that. Unfortunately, Ascend from Avernus exiles itself, so we won't be able to get that back, but Raise from the Past we can get back, or, anything else we may need to get back with that card. And then, of course, we are utilizing some group hug draw card spells in the deck. Like I mentioned, it's kind of group huggy, not a whole lot, but just enough to kind of give people that little pillow of like, oh, it's fine. He's letting us draw cards. He's only making a 2/2 or a 1/1 bunny, no big deal. But we are running Secret Rendezvous and Cut a Deal, so that way we can draw cards. So those are all the sorceries and the ones that need to be talked about. Let's move on into the instance. So we're running 13 instants in the deck. We have Aetherize, Counterspell, Dawn's Truce, Divine Resilience, Dovin's Veto, Generous Gift, Long River's Pull, Negate, Path to Exile, Perch Protection, Stroke of Midnight, and Swords to Plowshares. Now, our instants are basically targeted removal staples in counter magic. You all know these cards. Yeah, it seems kind of generic to run this stuff. I get it, but I mean, why not? You know? Because there's going to be a lot of removal that might get pointed at Kwain or the rabbits once people kind of see the game plan of trying to overrun the board. Now, we are running a couple cards to protect from board wipes by either giving our creatures indestructible or phasing out with cards like Perch Protection, Dawn's Truce, and Divine Resilience. Perch Protection is a 4 generic 2 white mana instant. It says, gift an extra turn. You may promise an opponent a gift as you cast the spell. If you do, they take an extra turn after this one. What will happen is you create 4 2/2 blue bird creature tokens with flying. If the gift was promised, all permanents you control phase out, and until your next turn, your life total can't change and you gain protection from everything. So basically, a fixed or more fair's protection. And then this card exiles itself afterwards. So it is a way to save yourself from a board wipe or a lethal swing, something like that. Now, obviously, you're not going to give the extra turn to the person who just tried to murder you, but you can make a deal with another player and maybe get some help after that. So, pretty cool card from Bloomborough. Definitely check that one out. And the Dawn's Truce is 1 generic, 1 white for an instant. It says gift a card. You may promise an opponent a gift as you cast the spell. If you do, they draw a card before its other effects. So you will cast this, say, hey, I will let you draw a card. If you do, then the effect of the card will go into effect, so to speak. So what it says is you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. If the gift was promised, permanents you control also gained indestructible until end of turn. So getting hexproof and indestructible of that, not too bad for 2 mana, and all you gotta do is let somebody draw a card. Fair enough. I mean, it's good for that reason, I think. And then finally, we have Divine Resilience, which is 1 white for an instant, but it has a kicker cost of 2 generic and a white. And it says target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, instead, any number of target creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So for 4 mana, you can make your whole board indestructible. Why wouldn't you want to do that? So yeah, you're going to have to hold up mana and kind of like play around board wipes and stuff like that. But if somebody's going to use targeted removal to get rid of something, unless they're going to exile it, this will help save it. So I think it's a pretty good card. Again, from Foundations, it's an uncommon. Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you want to use it in this deck? All right, so that's all of our instants. Let's go check out the artifacts. We're only running 6 artifacts in the deck. That's Arcane Signet, Banner of Kinship, Soul Ring, Talisman of Progress, and Thrumming Stone. So mostly we're running just mana artifacts to help ramp or play spells, obviously. Nothing too crazy, but the main 2 cards to note in the artifacts are Thrumming Stone and Banner of Kinship to kind of buff the rabbits a little bit more. Now, Thrumming Stone is kind of a must in decks like these. You know, any deck that runs like X amount of cards, you definitely want to have Thrumming Stone in it. And this one's no different. Now, although we do have other ways to get more hairs from our deck, this is the probably more well-known way. I'm going to get to the other card later. It's kind of a underrated, almost MVP kind of card in this deck, I think. And then, of course, Banner of Kinship is a new card from Foundations. It seems like a really cool and different way to kind of buff kindred creatures. So I thought it would be good to include in this deck to make the bunnies bigger, because obviously you want to have them kind of big to be a little bit more of a threat than just a 1/1. So that's it for the artifacts. Let's move on to the enchantments. We're only running 5. We have Anointed Procession, Endless Horizons, Remembrance, Valkyrie's Call, and Wizard class. Now, the enchantments are where some of the magic tech is in this deck, so to speak. You know, we all know Anointed Procession. It's a great card to double our tokens. While it's not mandatory for this deck, I wanted something in this deck to give it a little more power. Yes, it will most likely get removed as soon as it hits the board, but if you can get 1 or 2 extra bunnies out of it, that's fine. But the 2 cards I really want to focus on are Endless Horizons and Remembrance. Now, Endless Horizons is a 3 generic, 1 white enchantment that says, when it comes into play, search your library for any number of Plains cards, remove them from the game, then shuffle your library. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a card you own removed from the game with Endless Horizons into your hand. Now, the cool thing about this deck is that you really want to be churning through your deck as much as possible to be able to utilize the Thrumming Stone to its full extent. Endless Horizons will help thin your deck that way. Obviously, the downside is if this gets removed, all your planes are gone, you're kind of screwed. But that's fine. It's not really that big of a deal because if you have enough lands to just play a few bunnies a turn, it's not really going to affect the tempo too much. There are other lands in this deck, and it says plains, so there are 2 cards that we put in the land base, which I'll get to, that are plains islands. No, they're not shock lands, they're just the tap lands, but regardless, this will allow you to get them and put them exiled with it. So it's a good way to deck thin and utilize that card to its full extent. Remembrance is probably the MVP of this deck in that it says it is also a 3 generic 1 white enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature you control is put into a graveyard, you may search your library for a copy of that creature card. If you do, reveal that card, put it into your hand, and shuffle afterwards. So this basically, anytime somebody kills a Hare Apparent, we can go search our library for one and put it into our hand. And the craziest thing about this, or the coolest thing even, is if we happen to have like 4 or 5 out on the board and somebody does a board wipe, well, now we're going to get to go search for 5 Hare Apparents from our deck, put them into our hand, and have them to play next turn. That's a lot of deck thinning right there. Again, this is another card that will help in tandem with Endless Horizons to get the most out of Thrumming Stone. So this is like my MVP pick for this deck. Really cool card. Definitely don't sleep on this one for the Hare Apparent. Even if you're building in other colors, this should be like an auto include in the deck, 100%. So we're running 36 lands. Like I mentioned before in the last section, there are absolutely no basic islands. Okay, I know this is going to be weird. I built this land base a little weird to kind of play around or into the Endless Horizons, but there are just 20 basic planes, and then there are 2 cards that are the plain island type. So they will be able to get picked out of the deck with New Horizons cards. So you can also grab Glacial Floodplain, Idyllic Beachfront, Irrigated Farmland, Prairie Stream as well. So you'll be able to grab all those with that card as well. So you can use you'll thin your deck of at least 25 cards that way. If you take them all out, which like you really got nothing to lose by doing it. Why why not just go for it? You know what I mean? That's what I would do. I'd play pretty recklessly like that. But again, that's a very my play style. I kind of go like all or nothing with stuff like that. But with how low mana value the deck is, I think it'll be fine pulling all those lands out. Even if it gets removed in a couple turns, you should have enough lands by then to utilize it. So that's the deck list. Let's talk about some pros and cons of the deck. So one of the pros is that the overall deck has a very low mana value. All the rabbits are 2 mana, so you're going to be able to play multiples every other turn, most likely, which is good. So you'll be able to fill up the board pretty quick. Now that's also going to make you look kind of scary pretty quick, but it's just a 1/1. It's not that scary. That's the real thing you got to kind of explain to people. And another pro is that there are lots of protection pieces in the deck. Like I mentioned, there's a bunch of cards that give indestructible. Yes, you have to give a turn, stuff like that. And then, of course, the graveyard recursion. Those are 2 biggest pros of how the deck works is that you should be able to get a bunch of stuff out of your graveyard. No problem with this deck. And then, this one is a pro and a con. I put it in both, but group hug. There's lots of card draw in the deck. Now, group hug can be seen as a con for some players. I'm not really one of those players. I think it's a pro, if anything, because you're utilizing your deck to get ahead, but yes, at the same time, you're facilitating everybody else's game plan as well. But you have to play around that. And that's part of group hug that I don't think people really understand. So those are the pros of the deck. Let's talk about some cons. I think with how some of the removal stuff we have in the deck, like I mentioned, exiling all the planes or the throwing stone. If we aren't careful, we can very easily deck ourselves. Because also we have a lot of card draw in there with all that. Remembrance, throwing stone, endless horizons. These all kind of play off each other, and if we remove almost 40, 50 cards from our deck with just those 3 cards right there, that is not much left to work around. So be careful with that. It can happen. If it does, it's no big deal. It's just a small con, really. And then next up, we just have really wimpy creatures that most likely won't impact the board without those utility creatures sticking around or some of the utility artifacts like the banner to kind of buff up the creatures. Yes, I know that's why I think the people are playing white green, because it does that. It gives you more tools to buff the creatures and give them trample and stuff, which we don't really have in this deck. So it is kind of a con of the deck. And again, like I mentioned, group hug. Like I said, both a pro and a con. Some people love it, some people don't. And the aspect that you're letting your opponents draw cards definitely leans into a con of the deck for sure, because you are facilitating your opponent's game plans as well. So those are some of the pros and cons. And the one thing I kind of want to get across here too is that, this deck is more casual than anything. Yes, it has some control aspects, but don't expect a huge out of control board unless absolutely no one's playing removal. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we have a couple ways to win, but I'm not gonna lie, one of them is like absolute magic Christmas land here. Like I mentioned earlier, raise to pass sort of combos with Hare Apparent. If we can get enough of them into our graveyard when they enter, you'll just have a bunch of triggers off of each one entering, and they'll all make the tokens. And if for some reason Anointed Procession happens to be out when that happens, well, you're going to make even more tokens, and it'll fill the board really quickly, and you'll be able to then swing in with a bunch of 1/1s and see what happens. So that's really the main way, going wide, hoping to deal enough damage to everyone to win. The deck is very, very casual in that aspect, like I mentioned. Even though there's a few powerful staples like Throwing Stone and Anointed Procession, it's not a very high tier deck. Like, this is a dirtle deck. That's what I call it. You're not going to really do much to impact the board. You're just going to try and make a bunch of bunnies for fun. It's a fun deck. That's all it is. It's not going to. It could probably play against a precon and do okay. If anything, this is very precon-y in my opinion. And I built it that way on purpose. I wasn't trying to go for like really crazy stuff with it. I could do that, but that's just kind of how I wanted to play it. A little more group huggy, a little more fun. Just like, hey man, let me sit back and make some bunnies. No big deal. So that is how we built Hare Apparent with Kwain. If you wanted to see me do it another way, please let me know. I would definitely love to show all the different ways you can build Hare Apparent, because there are quite a few. We could go Boros, we could do Mardu. I mean, we could do every color combination realistically, and there would be some really cool way to utilize it. But I chose Kwain, a little bit group huggy, so that's what we did. Thank you all so much for checking out this deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it. Something a little more casual here instead of crazy combo-y and, uh, just something fun to have, because I figured this card was fun and a lot of people are going to be looking to build it. And I wanted to do something different than how everybody else had been building it that I've seen so far personally. So that's this week's deck tech. Trying to do these like once a month now, maybe every 2 weeks, just depending on like my time. I have a lot of stuff that I do outside of this, so this is just kind of like a hobby for me, and I enjoy Magic the Gathering, as I'm sure you all know. I have this little series I've been doing with like underrated EDH cards. You can check those out as well on the channel. If you like this, please subscribe, leave a comment. I try to respond to everything. I appreciate you all checking out the videos. Like, no joke, it's so awesome the feedback that I'm seeing about everything, and I really appreciate you all. I do have another deck tech in mind that I'm doing that is also from Foundations. I figured I would do the Niv-Mizzet because why not? Even though it seems like a really bad commander to me. He is strong, but man, that mana value, I don't like it. So thank you all so much for checking us out. I'm Wildcard MTG, and we'll see you on the next one.